Chairman.
Senator Wyden.
Thank you, Senator Brown, and I commend you for scheduling a very important hearing and on a topic that really gets short shrift, and I commend you for it. Gentlemen, I am struck by how many folks come up and describe accounts that invariably get into the question of their pension melting away. They're talking about hopes and dreams that they had had for years essentially evaporating because their pension isn't going to be there. And of course, there are a lot of pieces to this puzzle. And the recession is a factor, the aging workforce is a factor. Certainly, it's hard to follow how some of the changes at the state level affects private pensions. There are a host of issues that go into this mix. But I'm also struck by some of the reports that some in the private sector, businesses, and those in the retirement industry seem to be doing some wheeling and dealing with pension funds. And we recently came across the work of a Wall Street Journal reporter, Ellen Schultz, who apparently has done a fair amount of writing on this. She says, and she's not talking about all the businesses and all the people in the retirement industry, but she's saying that there are some who have taken billions of dollars from pension funds to finance downsizings and have sold the assets in merger deals. They've talked about how there are loopholes and discrimination rules that permit pension plans to be tapped to pay, in effect, for executive payment arrangements, executive parachutes, things of that nature. They talk about the exploitation of new accounting rules, which create an incentive to cut benefits, and cut benefits even when there was a pretty good argument that the pension had enough money. And I was struck by this account, and clearly this reporter, a distinguished reporter, is not saying this is every business or everyone in the retirement industry, but I would be interested and start with you, Mr. Baker, and you, Mr. Biggs, because you all have been in the field. How serious is this problem of the siphoning dollars from pension funds to finance downsizing, and the kind of wheeling and dealing that Ms. Schultz describes in really specific kind of instances? Is this a serious part of this? And if so, what kind of enforcement efforts could be put in place to deal with this? Because this really looks to me like it's way over the line, and if not looting of private pension funds, certainly is pretty serious financial misconduct that shouldn't be tolerated. Start with you, Mr. Baker, and then you, Mr. Biggs. How serious a problem are these issues? Mr. Baker.
Well, I do think it is a very serious problem. Just to be clear, I don't think that explains much of the issue in terms of workers facing inadequate retirement, in large part just because there aren't that many workers that still have defined benefit pensions. But you certainly have a number of instances which she documents where certainly people are violating the intent of the law, whether they're violating the letter of the law, I can't really speak to, but clearly the intent of the law is that once money is in a pension, it's supposed to stay in a pension. It's used for those workers' retirement. And she gives several accounts of ways in which major companies were able to effectively pull money out of those pensions in order to finance a merger, finance downsizing, whatever you want to say. And that should not happen. So, that requires greater policing, greater scrutiny, and probably greater penalties so that when you can determine that someone has in fact violated the law, that it's not just a slap on the wrist. So you want to play a game and see if you can get away with it, well, you might risk some time in jail. I think that would make people more reluctant to do so.
Let's have your colleague get into this, Mr. Biggs.
One of the problems with defined benefit pensions, which I didn't mention in my testimony, is that it's very easy for a plan sponsor to not do the right thing. It's easy to promise benefits, but nobody wants to pay for them. That's true in the corporate sector, it's true in the state and local sector. Defined benefit plans are very complex. They require a whole range of assumptions regarding what's going to go on in the future to determine what you have to pay today. It is very easy to avoid doing the right thing. A defined contribution plan is much more transparent. If your employer says, I'm going to put X amount into your 401k this year, they either put X in or they don't put X in. The monitoring is much easier. That doesn't say there are not similar problems in 401ks. There's a recent case, I believe it was International Paper, where they were accused of essentially funding employee contributions into a fund that had their own stock that charged them too much. That sort of thing can happen, but I think it should be punished. But by and large, I think it's not a major explanatory factor in problems we have in retirement security today for the reasons Dean mentioned.
Well, let's do this. And I asked it the way I did because this, to me, really is, and what's useful about what Senator Brown, Senator Casey are trying to do. This is the kind of fact-finding effort that we ought to be doing more of. And, you know, Ms. Schultz is an award-winning journalist. She is not saying that this is going on at every company plan or every part of the retirement industry. But suffice it to say, if you have the kind of documented examples, you know, here, and you don't have enforcement against those kinds of instances, that certainly is an invitation to others to try to skirt the rules. Mr. Baker, have you or any of those who have been advocating for workers done some writing on suggestions with respect to penalties and consumer protections for workers that ought to be put in place?
I haven't written directly on this particular issue, and I can't say, I'd imagine others have. I just have to say I'm not familiar with it. But I do have to say, you know, I kind of look at this as part of, you know, a set of, you know, malfeasance, I think in many cases probably criminal actions that were taken in part of the financial crisis. And, you know, as we know, almost no one has gone to jail in connection with that. And I do think, you know, that raises a serious issue. It's not one just of punishment. We might want that. But more importantly, the question of incentives, that if people think that they could violate the law and at very worst their company faces a modest fine, you're not discouraging that behavior. And we seem to understand that in other contexts. I don't quite understand why we don't apply that in the financial sector.
I'm way over my time, Senator Brown. Thank you. I would be open to suggestions from either of you two and from other panel members, because it struck me as an important set of issues that ought to be part of this debate. You go to a conference, you go to some academic setting, and people talk to you about the recession, they talk to you about the aging workforce. Then you see people at a town hall meeting and they talk about their pension, you know, melting away, and they have questions about how that happened. And I think we ought to be looking at some of those issues. Thank you, Senator Brown. I thank you for your good work.
Thank you, sir.